Augustine's Rule, a commentary by Adler Zumkeller, OSA, Chapter 12, Cleanliness and Care of Health. Augustine was a citizen of the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was a civilized and cultured world. One evidence of this is the ruins of the public baths from that period that are to be found in various places. Even the small military colonies along the Rhine and the Germanic frontier had their bathing places because the people of the Roman Empire took frequent baths for granted as they did the regular washing of their clothing. As a result, Augustine takes up this subject in his rule. His instructions on cleanliness and care of health are marked by prudence. As I mentioned earlier, he sharply rejected the aberrations of some monastic circles of the time, which regarded neglect of the outward person as an ideal. In his view, the spirit of Christian asceticism does not demand an unkempt exterior. Quite the contrary, beauty of soul may and should manifest itself in, and among other things, order and cleanliness in body and clothing. Regular cleaning of clothing and linen is therefore taken for granted in this chapter of the Augustinian Rule. But Augustine is well aware that concern for externals can easily be carried too far. For this reason, he wants superiors to regulate the cleaning of garments and to determine when and how often it is to be done. His intention is to keep personal whim from playing a part in the concern for externals and to prevent too great a desire for clean clothing from becoming the source of interior stains on the soul. Posidus, Augustine's biographer, tells us that the saint himself always followed the golden mean in these matters. His clothing and shoes, and his bedding as well, were modest, but in keeping with his state of life, neither overly fastidious nor careless. Posidus continues, for in these matters people usually go to one or other extreme by putting too much emphasis on them or paying too little attention to them. Life, chapter 22, section 1. Augustine wants us to follow the same middle path between imprudent carelessness and excessive anxiety in care for our bodily health. He himself had a weak constitution and was often ill, an experience which led him to show special concern for the sick and feeble in his rule. But this same experience also gave him a correct understanding of proper care of health. He explicitly requires that the sick be denied nothing which is necessary for their recovery. Third chapter of the Rule. The norm here, however, is not the personal whim and desire of the sick themselves, but the prudent judgment of a physician. The sick are to follow his orders in the spirit of monastic obedience. Unlike the many devout Christians of his time who for ascetical reasons denied themselves visits to the public baths, St. Augustine did not hesitate to visit and to let others visit the public baths. The visits were to be made, however, not simply for the sake of bodily comfort, but when reasons of health made them necessary and advantageous. A regulation already stated generally in an earlier chapter of the Rule, chapter 4, is repeated for this special situation. As in other excursions from the house, so in visits to the baths, no one is to go alone. Augustine was well aware that the bathhouses were places of lechery. Instruction of the Unlearned, chapter 16, 25. The earlier Roman severity in regulating the bathhouses had been relaxed by this time, and the baths had frequently become places of rampant immorality. End of this chapter. Chapter 13 of the Commentary on Augustine's Rule, the monastic spirit of work. In this chapter, St. Augustine speaks of the attitude we ought to have in carrying out our temporal labors and duties. He is aware, of course, that a monastery has many offices and tasks, even though he explicitly mentions only the infirmarian and those in charge of kitchen, wardrobe, and library. To all who have an office to discharge in the monastery, he gives this simple but fundamental directive: they should serve their brothers or sisters without grumbling. A loving spirit of service should mark everything they do. Every office in a monastery is a service to the community. We show that we see our tasks in that light when we perform them without grumbling, that is, eagerly, courteously, and even joyfully. This principle holds even for the less pleasant duties of our office or profession. When we respond in this way, we are acting according to an earlier directive of Augustine. We place the common good before our own, not our own before the common good. Chapter 5. Augustine himself gave us an example of what it means concretely to prefer the common good to our own. After being unexpectedly ordained a priest in Hippo against his own wishes, he devoted himself zealously and with a deep sense of responsibility to his new tasks as pastor and later as bishop. There were many duties he did not relish at all, in particular the heavy burden of judicial activity. The Christian emperors had given the bishops of the realm authority to act as judges, and the faithful preferred to bring their disputes and suits to a bishop rather than to a civil judge. The result was that Augustine frequently had to listen to quarreling folk for hours at a time. His patience and prudence often succeeded in effecting a compromise both parties could accept, and he was always able to introduce pastoral exhortation and advice. Nonetheless, he always found this service taxing. He wrote as follows on one occasion: "I would much rather work with my hands at set hours every day, as men do in properly ordered monasteries, and have other times free for reading and praying or studying the Scriptures, instead of suffering the torments and perplexities caused by the problems of others, because I must act as a judge or mediator in secular disputes." On the Work of Monks 29:37. He knew, however, that he must be a servant of Christ and a servant of the servants of Christ. Letter 217. He therefore put the common good before his own, and willingly accepted even the wearisome functions expected of him as a bishop. We too must show that our love is genuine by serving others selflessly. In the final analysis, this ministering love determines the value of our activity as religious. Those inspired by it give the community the best they have and render it true service, even if they occupy only subordinate positions. Those who lack this service oriented love and seek only themselves and their personal success and prestige in what they do are at bottom unfruitful members of the community. This is true, even if they fill important offices and perhaps are even in very successful by external standards. This chapter of the rule mentions the monastery's books, that is, a small library from which, at a fixed hour each day, the members of the community could borrow material for private reading. As Augustine says elsewhere, this daily reading was from the books of sacred scripture and other good books. This prescription of the rule is an interesting indication of the degree of education possessed by the members of Augustine's monasteries, including the lay monks and the cloistered women. Illiterate monks and nuns must have been the exception. Anyone unable to read at the time of entrance was evidently taught to do so immediately.